Hi, everybody. My name is Ezra Capel. I'm a professor of Jewish Studies and English and director of the Perlmutter Fellows Program here at the College of Charleston. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you this evening event, which is, of course, with Mikhal Dekel. And we are going to be discussing her recently published book, Tehran Children, a Holocaust Refugee Odyssey. And tonight's event is sponsored by the Charleston Jewish Bookfest and also the Zerka Goldberg Center for Holocaust Studies and of course the Yashik Arnold Jewish Studies Program. And tonight's main event here, Mikhal Dekel, our author, was born in Haifa, Israel, to a Holocaust refugee father and an Israeli-born mother. And over the course of 7 intense years, she completed her mandatory military service, earning an LLB from Tel Aviv University's Bachman School of Law. She interned at Tel Aviv State Attorney's Office, and she joined the Israel Bar Association before deciding to take a break and move over to New York, where she traveled to regroup and worked at different odd jobs. And that is where I got to know Mikhal a little bit back in the early to mid 90s, I guess that was, when she was getting a degree at City College of New York, where she got a degree in English there, and then started a doctoral program, which she eventually completed, of course, at Columbia University. And she now lives in Manhattan with her family and teaches English and Comp Lit at City College and the CUNY Graduate Center. And she directs CCNY's Rifkin Center for the Humanities and Arts, which is an incredible center. And she has done amazing things with that. I remember when that center was just sort of getting started, and she has done, had amazing events through that. So if you're interested, you should go to the Rifkin Center and learn more about all of those activities. Tehran's Children is the culmination of Mikhal's decade-long journey to understand her father and the Odyssey at the core of his young adulthood, an experience which he never talked about, although it informed every aspect of his being. His wartime Odyssey was also part of a larger chapter of the history of World War II, that of refugees in Central Asia and the Middle East. And the fact that most Polish Jews who survived the war had followed this path was virtually unknown when she began writing this book. Prior to publishing Tehran's Children, Mikhal has published 2 other books, The Universal Jew, Masculinity, Modernity, and the Zionist Moment, and the Hebrew monograph, Oedipus, the Kishinev. And she's also published many articles and blogs on topics ranging from George Eliot's Hebrew translations, something that everyone should know about, and tragedy and revenge in Israeli literature, and autism in the English novel. And she's received numerous grants for her work and teaches really a very large range of courses up at City College and at the CUNY Grad Center. We are just really, really glad to have her here. Unfortunately, she can't be with us due to COVID in person, but we are very privileged to have her with us on Zoom this evening and hope to have her back again in person at some point when all of this madness is over. And so without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mikhal Dekel to our audience here this evening.
Thank you so much, Ezra. I don't think I've done any event. I've done, I think this is my 59th event since the book came out, but none of them has been with a former student who's now a prominent professor as well. So this is so much fun, and gives me so much pleasure to see you again. And I thank you all for coming.
Well, we thank you for being here. And I thought we could start just by asking you a question that gives you a little bit of an overview maybe about the project itself here. And towards the outset of your book, you speak of following no theory, no model or roadmap. Instead, you basically follow the actors, right, and getting the story of Tehran Children. And can you give us a little bit of a brief overview of what that was like and what you discovered following the actors in this remarkable odyssey of hardship, suffering, and survival?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, first of all, to not following, to not using any model. I mean, as you know, because I think we both come from English and we come from the humanities, and we are trained as people who were trained in the 1990s and 2000s. We're trained with a lot of theories about post-colonial theories, theories of nationalism, and and I feel when I started doing this project, I was a lot more. I was imposing certain kind of frameworks that as I was finding out the details, I was shedding them. And this is what I mean in the introduction. Now, basically the book is, the way I would describe it is part history, part memoir, and part travel narrative, and which is my own travel narrative as I travel around the world following in the footsteps of these refugees. When I talk about these refugees, including my father, I'm talking about people. Maybe I'll share with you. Let me share a map with you, and I'll just show you real quick the course of the journey, and you'll be able to see it. So this is. Let me see if I can make this. It's always like the story of sharing things that it takes time to put it up, but let me show you real quick, and I can share some other slides with you if you want. Okay, so first of all, so this is a map of divided Poland. So in 1939, as we know, first German forces invade Poland, and then Soviet forces in Poland gets partitioned between German occupied the side and the Soviet occupied side. The people who I talk about in my book are the people who either escaped, and this is the story of my family, from the German side into the Soviet side, so it's across this border. So let's say they escaped to the Bialystok and these areas on the border, or they simply lived in those areas and fell under Soviet occupation. In 1939, 1.5 million Polish Jews are living on the Soviet side. So that's out of 3.3. So that's quite a bit of people. Of those people, about a third of them gets deported for one reason to another into the Soviet interior. And now I'll show you so this is the map of their journey. So they basically start here. They, in the case of my family, escape here to Bialystok. They're then deported to labor camps in the Soviet interior, in their case in the north, but really there were labor camps all over. After about 14 months, they're released from these labor camps. They continue on to another exile to Central Asia, basically to the Central Asian republics, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, where most of them will stay for the duration of the war. And of course, many, many people die along the way, and we can talk about that later. A minority of them, some of them, continue on to Iran through the Caspian Sea to Iran. This is Bandar Pahlavi, Tehran, and later on are evacuated to mandatory Palestine in a very long route through the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, the Suez Canal, and into Jerusalem. So the story that I tell is the story of their story, but also my story as I piece together the puzzle of their story. And the reason I have to tell it this way, or I decided to tell it this way, is because this is not a very well-known story. So in many ways, I had to define what the story is. In other words, if you discover that your father was, God forbid, an Auschwitz survivor, even if your father never spoke, you know what Auschwitz is because you already read Primo Levi and you already read Art Spiegelman, but here there was no Primo Levi of this story. And so in some ways I had to write that story, which is why it took a long time, and also why I tell the story of my own search.
Right, absolutely. And we'll get to that, the fact that you are basically creating the way to tell this story, right, in the writing of it, right, because it is such an unknown and remarkable story, and it's there for such a big book, right? It's filled with watershed events, a large cast of characters caught up in these often tragic events. And I wanted us to be at the outset of our conversation, because it's such an important part of the book. I thought we would begin in the beginning of our discussion with the figure of the refugee, right? A child refugee, which hovers over this entire book and this enormous story, as we saw, spanning continents and decades. And so I really wanted to dig into a key moment of your remarkable book, and I urge everyone to get a copy and read it from cover to cover. It is spellbinding, truly. And I wanted to really get into this figure and discuss this figure of the refugee, which haunts every page. And that is, of course, the image of Hanan, right? Your father, a hungry, cold, scared, and scarred child, really, right? I wanted just read a very short paragraph from your book towards the last sections of the book, in which you start talking about this memoir, right, of a Ashkenazi Jewish doctor. And in discussing this doctor, his name is, Dr. Hirschberg, in just the way he describes the Jews that he meets in Iraq, he calls them Arab Jews, right? And it's the first time you feel that that term has been used. And, there's you mentioned about all the theory that we were trained under, and there's this notion to want to turn it into his description into one of colonizer and colonized. But as you say, and I just read the short paragraph, you say, but a binary, a colonial model that pits colonizer against colonized, Ashkenazi against Sephardi, Jew against Muslim, in an unchanging hierarchical or exploitative pattern was insufficient to describe the complex network of encounters that took place between everyone and everything in that moment, right? Not just in Iran, but in all of these places where these refugees are. And so you go on to list so many of them. It's just a remarkable, remarkable paragraph. I won't read it in its entirety, but I'll just go to a couple of pages later where you give us this figure, right, of the refugee. A moving figure, you say, homeless, poor, a bit of a tabula rasa, a particle whose fate was determined by tinier and more arbitrary factors than the larger categories. And so I'm wondering, of course, this is what great literature does for us, right? It takes us beyond this simple description so we could truly see and feel. So my question for you, Mikhal, is the story of Tehran Children about refugees in the Holocaust era. What does it teach us about today's refugees, right? Particularly children refugees who are arriving by the thousands on the US-Mexico border. Even as we speak this evening, right, there are 4,200 unaccompanied migrant children who are sleeping on space blankets on US soil this evening, right? And so what can we learn from that image of Hanan and from the story that you uncover so painstakingly over so many years that could teach us about what's happening in the world today?
Yeah, I was actually just reading that in the New York Times. I just, and I had the same thoughts, because there were these photographs of like sort of 1-year-old unaccompanied children. And yeah, I mean, I think, I grew, as you know, grew up in Israel, and in Israel, the Tehran Children story is not told as the story of child refugees. It's told as the story of a great rescue, and it's very heroic, and these children were essentially brought to mandatory Palestine, raised in the yeshuv, and it was a success story, which it was. I'm not denying it. What my book did, though, I mean, I always say in Israel, the story is told from the end to the beginning. I told it from the beginning to the end. So I follow every moment of these children's life as they flee their homes in Poland, and then what happens to them later on. And I think at some point, what I realized is that what I knew in Israel was essentially a fiction. And it's a fiction in the sense that at some point, these children's identity was very precarious. I mean, they were no longer, I mean, I wouldn't say they lost their Jewishness necessarily, but their identity was determined by very small things. And there was this one passage that was really telling for me. In Tehran, when these children come to Tehran, representatives from the Yishuv, from the Jewish population in Palestine, come there clandestinely and start talking to them and organize them and so on. And there is one, I don't know if you remember this from the book, but there was one, and all of them wrote memoirs. I mean, the good thing is that, Jews write a lot. So it was a matter of digging this stuff up. But there was one guy who wrote, I came to the children and I started telling them stories of Eretz Israel, of the land of Israel. And I told them that we're going to be celebrating Passover differently than they are used to in their homes. And they said, but how did we used to celebrate? How did we celebrate? Because, they had been, especially the younger ones who had been refugees. It's not just refugees, just deportees. It's under condition of extreme hunger, and it's starvation, not hunger, starvation. A lot of them very sick, separated from their parents and so on. So that precariousness really was very real to me as I was researching the book. And then, of course, that does take you to thinking about other children who are precarious at this moment. And I don't think, I mean, obviously the circumstances are very different, and especially since, these children were refugees within a war in which most of their relatives are being butchered somewhere else. But still, the precariousness of children and separated from their parents is still there. The vulnerability, especially of the separation from their parents, in their case, was something that I never realized. I never realized that was such a defining moment in this story of hunger and starvation and death. Probably the separation from their parents was the most traumatic event in many ways, especially for the younger children, because a child out in the world without an adult can be prey to anybody, really, there's a certain vulnerability, and I think that you never lose that vulnerability. I mean, I think my father, even though my father was in the Israeli Air Force, and obviously he had children, he had a life, but he had that kind of vulnerability that stayed with him. So I do think that, I think we shouldn't separate children from parents. I think to the degree that we can, we should try to provide them care.
Right. And I think that empathy it comes through on every page, right? This almost the shock, right, of recognition that these are children that are suffering here, even though, and that's what I think you mean about the story from the beginning to the end. Yes, they were saved, but then the shocking condition that they're in, and when you see that they're not getting the supplies, right? The palpable anger that comes through, because it's just so wrong, and there's nothing that you can do about this other than document what actually happened, right? Which is what you're doing in this very important book, and through all the historical artifacts that you've uncovered here and put together. So yes, absolutely, very important to think about that, and why it's so important for us to understand in and of themselves these stories, but also how we can learn from them, right? And see what we could do and change at this point in time. I want to point out one other section you talk about and discussing that vulnerability, and certainly vulnerability is a part of what childhood is, right? It's about being vulnerable to the world and learning through that, and not being crushed by it, right? Through hunger and starvation and lack of proper clothing and housing and everything else that happens to the success story, right? These are the happiest stories of the Holocaust that we have to keep reminding ourselves, right? And yet you say in this book, in your book, you write, September 6, 1939 was the end of Hanan and Regina's childhood, and of their childhood selves, and in their stead emerged tiny adults, the persons I knew as my aunt and father, quiet, responsible, intelligent, taking up as little space as possible, as if they were still squeezed into an overpacked truck. And I think that really encapsulated so much of the identity, even decades later, of many of folks who have been through experiences like this. And I couldn't help but think, and I see many of my students both from UTEP and of course here at the College of Charleston. We have my whole class from, was with us this evening on Holocaust film, has joined with us. And really glad to see them. Many of my students have studied Art Spiegelman, Maus, which you mentioned a little bit earlier. And of course, we know that as this canonical work that deals with both, the survivor first generation and second generation story. And I'm wondering, in your own work here, Mikhal, in relation to your work, how much of that description of your father's story as a child survivor, refugee, how much of that might apply to a second generation as well, in your own role that becomes so important to this work as well?
No, that's a great question. It's a really great question. I think it does apply, and and I write about that a little bit. I think there is a sense in which um, that kind of, I don't know if survivor mentality, but I mean definitely this idea of just kind of carrying on
Mhm,
that toughness, maybe the that does, I think that does translate into the next generation, or it did translate to the next generation. And I think it's, for me, my book is being translated into Hebrew these days, and the translator, who's actually happens to be an Iraqi, I mean somebody whose parents came from Iraq, a guy also. He's a wonderful translator. He usually translates from the Greek. And he said to me, with that description, it's in the beginning of my father, he said, "Oh my God, you described like our entire father's generation in Israel." And I do think that there is something of that nature and so my book, I think, is also who I am and also who my father was, does have to do also to an extent with coming to Israel and becoming an Israeli and what that meant.
mhm,
Um, but so I do think it translated to the next generation. And again, one of the things that was liberating for me in this, yes, I uncovered terrible things, but it's very liberating to understand this whole trajectory, including who your father and your aunt were before the war. I mean, my aunt, I always knew as this, as you wrote, this responsible person who's always like, everything is fine, I'll sit in the dark kind of a person, was this, this very difficult child, this who with a lot of tantrums and who took up a lot of space before the war. They were also wealthy. They were also um, they had an expansive life, and all of that shrunk with the refugee experience, and never really, to an extent, never fully opened up again. Um, and though, again, I mean, they had normative lives and families and jobs and so on.
mhm.
So I do think it. Yes, I mean, I think it definitely. Um, I grew up with those behaviors, and I think in many ways I adopted them. I mean, it's a little bit different, I think, from the Art Spiegelman model, but it's its own model.
No, for sure. No, it is quite different, but and yet, the trauma of what your father went through and didn't speak about, right? How important that was for you and your siblings, right? And your whole family. And of course, you had your grandmother with you when you were younger, and your aunt, and people who were in so many ways affected by this. And that's a very powerful thing about your book, which is that it makes mention a few times of the camps, but very rarely, because it's not a story, of course, about the camps. It's a story about the Holocaust in a very different context, and a deeply important context, one which is not nearly as well known as you point out. Hopefully with your book, more people will know a lot more about this. And there's so many other important things that radiate from that story. And one of them is, of course, a lot of discoveries that you made along the way. And one of them is that you discover that there are so many well-intentioned people working to save these Jewish refugees, right? There's a long section in which you talk about the joint, right? The Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, and how efficient they are, how much money that they're raising and what they're doing and how hard they're working to try to save these Jewish folks, and their expectations there will be many tens of thousands of refugees more. So they're not just working for these 1,000, not as if that's not enough, that is, but they're in their minds, they're working for many, many tens and hundreds of thousands of people that they fully expect to be able to save, which of course doesn't materialize, as we know. But can you talk a little about that? Because I think that idea is a reclaiming of certain ways of thinking that goes against a lot of prevailing notions. I'm thinking of Hassia Diner's recent book about Holocaust commemoration in the diaspora, and maybe you could talk about that a little bit in relation to some of these changing notions of how we view some of the failures, but also some of the attempts, of course, to really rescue Jewish people from the depths of the horror of which they found themselves in.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that contemporary Holocaust research is definitely going in that direction of also looking at attempts and not just at successful attempts of and I think here, and I think this is the other side. I'm telling you a very terrible story to an extent, but there are a lot of bright lights, and the bright lights are exactly those communities, first of all, Jewish communities around the world, mostly the Joint Distribution Commission, but also other Jewish aid organizations, and the Jews of Palestine. And so all of these groups are also in Montreal and in Argentina and in London. So, I mean, you can look at the empty side of the glass and see, I mean, there are a lot of problems and a lot of frictions even between them, and they're trying to work with the Polish government in exile, and that doesn't really always work out. But there are people. So while my father was this little child who felt he is completely alone in the world, and nobody in the whole world sees him, and he's stuck in some godforsaken labor camp in Siberia, in Arkhangelsk, there are a lot of people around the world who know about him and are trying to do something or other, which includes diplomacy with the Soviet government and with the Polish government in exile and with the American government. And I mean, it's really, the story that I tell is a kind of global history of the Holocaust. It is very different from the stories that we usually talk about because it happens over many continents. It's very connected to the history of empire, was the British Empire and the Soviet Empire. They are successful to an extent. They're successful with these children, getting these children out of the Soviet Union into Iran anyway. And also successful in then rehabilitating them in Palestine, and getting aid to the refugees in the Soviet Union at some point in 42. So it's those things are very heartwarming. They're also very heartwarming instances on the ground of just hospitality of individual people, whether it's in Uzbekistan or it's in Iran, and where there might be a Persian man who will just see these children and will be so horrified at how they look that he'll just go and buy the contents of the candy stall and give to the children. It's on a human level, not on a kind of government level or any organized level. And then there's the reciprocity. I mean, I don't know if you remember, but there's towards the end of the book, the Tehran children who are on the ship on the way to Palestine, that ship stops in Aden, in Yemen, and the children are told, you have to stay down below in the dock because it's a hostile country and this is already in the middle of the Arab-Jewish conflict. But of course, they're children, they can't stay down. So they all go up onto the deck, and around them, they see hundreds and hundreds of Yemenite children who are standing there, and they say, this is the first time we saw children that looked worse than us, because they're like, they're completely malnutritioned. So these children go into the kitchen of the boat or the ship that they're on and start throwing food to these children, these other children. So, this is just a moment, right? This is just one moment. But I think what I try to do in the book is to capture those moments and to and to expose them rather than just gloss over them as part of a bigger story. And I think, when, to go back to what we talked about before in your previous question, my father was really a very introverted and closed up man. And I think if he would have, I think if he, in a way, if he would have talked, and if he would have known all of this stuff, in a way, I think he would have felt better. Because I think it's maybe it's not ideal, but it's not so binary. It's not just like, this is a jungle in which these Jewish children are just hunted down. It's more complex than that.
Right. No, absolutely. That's such a powerful moment that shows the vulnerability of children on all sides, right? And as bad as they have it, that here are people who are even worse off than they are right now, that they are gotten a little bit more food and they're on their way to safety, and they're confronted with almost a mirror image of what they just were, right? Just a few days prior to this. It's a very powerful moment and very illustrative of that vulnerability of all children, right? And why they need such protection, and how powerful and moving this story is, that they weren't getting that, right? And that even many of these supplies were not getting to where they were supposed to, and there were people profiteering at every level, and getting, yeah, I mean, the anger is palpable, as well it should be, very well placed here at the awfulness of that, and the images of the children, as you mentioned in the book. When you see that image of them, they do look so emaciated. It's as awful as the survivor pictures that we've seen from the camps themselves. The children in those images, right? That we see the state that they're in. So speaking about looking at things a little bit more complexly, as you always do in this book, contemporary Poland comes up quite a bit in the book, and your trips to Poland over the last decade, researching the book, and of course, historically, you bring in so many of these issues. Jan Gross talks about this as well, and Neighbors, of how the Jewish community are blamed often for welcoming the occupiers, right, of the Soviets, right? And it's such a complicated situation, of course, right? That, I mean, who are you choosing, the Soviets or the Nazis here, right? So, and the Jews are being blamed on both sides, much like the Soviet Polish campaign of 1920 that you speak about earlier in the book, right? The Jews that Isaac Babel wrote about so powerfully, right? The Jews are stuck in the middle of all of this, and you talk about a friend of yours, Magda Gowin, who's now part of the Law and Justice government in Poland. And, of course, recently in the news, there are cases of scholars who are being brought up on charges and being, prosecuted and fined, and all of this, the awfulness of talking about Polish complicity in the Holocaust here. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, the need, of course, as your book makes clear, for a more nuanced view of this tragic history than what is being offered in contemporary political theater.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I've sort of evolved in this case, and not in a good direction, I would say, because so Magda Gowin is currently the Deputy Minister of Culture for the Polish government. But when I knew her, I mean, she reached out to me, and the reason she reached out to me is because her family hails from the same town as my family. Right. So it was completely arbitrary. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know who she was. And I really, I always say that Israelis, like, their main strength is their ignorance, right? So it's like, I was like, great, I'll go to Poland. And I didn't really look this woman up. And she invited me to give a talk, and she offered to take me to visit with me in what she called our parents' town. Mm-hmm. And I spent a week with her, and a lot of what she schooled me in, which is Polish suffering, and everything that happened to this town after my father's family escaped, I didn't know, and I was very fascinated. But a lot of it is now the PIS's sort of official line. And she herself is involved in a lot of this revisionism, just which includes, for example, opening many museums and monuments for Poles who saved Jews, which is not, it's not exactly a lie, but it's a kind of skewed representation of what really happened. And so, but when I was there, she was just a historian. I didn't know that like a year later she would become a politician, and this government would come to. But now I'm actually in touch. In fact, I just wrote a long article about my relationship with her, which I hope will come out, very soon in one of the in Harper's or one of these magazines. So it's for me I came in as as an Israeli who and also as the daughter of a survivor, and I think I came in, for me, I couldn't care less about that town initially. For me, it was the place that my father escaped from. It's Poland for me was this terrible place. I mean, I that's what I absorbed as a child, that was extremely anti-Semitic, and so I never spent 1 minute thinking about what happened to this town under Nazi occupation after my father left. And so for me to kind of to learn the Polish side was sort of interesting, and even, perversely liberating too, because it was, okay, other people suffered too, so on. But then, of course, now it's taken to such an extreme, and it's basically propaganda and lies, and finally now lawsuits against historians. And I know Jan Grabowski very well, and now I know a lot of historians on the Polish left as well. So I know the ones on the right and the ones on the left, and I know that what the government is doing now is sort of really to actively suppress any kind of research and talk about Polish complicity, and that is, of course, we know, very problematic. But again, to make things complex. I mean, I went to Poland for the first time. I understood many things about my father. I realized he was Polish, in many ways. The way he acted, the things he did, the way he dressed. I mean, I felt right. I'd never was my first time in Poland. I felt right at home, like I sort of knew these people, and so it was, and then I realized also my father's family lived in this town for 8 generations. So it was, again, a very painful history, but also a very complex history that I tried to represent. I mean, in fact, I have a lot more material in Poland that didn't make it into the book, because the book as it is huge. So Norton was like, you cut that out, and that will probably become its own book very soon.
Well, no, you do. You do try to work in so many of these difficult complexities, and the attempt on your part to try to keep an open mind about things, right? To try to continue to be empathetic, even though there's certain ways that people are pushing against what you know to be the truth about certain stories, but yet this is inevitable. It's going to happen, right? When people have competing narratives and different sides of stories, and that there was so much suffering around the war, for sure. And I agree. When I brought students for the first time to Poland, it was amazing to me to see the complexity of the situation there. There's a small museum in Krakow, right, which tells the history of the city under the Nazis. And as if that's not bad enough, then there's this tiny corner, right, of the horrible history under the Soviet regime as well, right? And you start to recognize the suffering of Poland as well, which is, what you're trying to do. Of course, when people try to simplify that and say it's either or, it's one or the other, that's when we get into problems here, right? So I think in your work, you're trying to keep an open mind about that. But
yeah, many of my friends think my mind was too open. I mean, I always say I get hate mail from Polish nationalists, Jewish nationalists, anti-Zion, Pakistani nationalists, Iranian. So which I guess is a good sign in some way. But I think yes, I try to keep an open mind. I now think a little bit. I mean, I still have I mean, yes, I do think that the Poles suffered a lot, but I think all of these museums are very politicized, and we sort of have to read, and museums and monuments, and you have to read through them. I mean, there's always a kind of political message, which I didn't really know how to read through that yet at that point. So you have to, I think on the one hand, you have to keep a very naive, open mind, because I do think that's a way to come to anything. And on the other hand, I think you have to be reading a little bit more critically.
Right. And, you know, just to touch on a couple of other elements of your book and reading critically and keeping an open mind, you know, you discovered through archives so much of the story. And it was in the Gera Hasidim in Bnei Brak that you discovered your father's testimony. Who would have guessed that there was even an archive there and that they had this incredible testimony of your father? That must have been quite an amazing discovery. But
Amazing.
then amazing, right? But then taking that in another direction, you talk about the politicization of the Tehran Children. It's not just, it's in Israel, of course, as well, where this became a major political issue. And you talk about Ayala Rothenberg, right, who writes, who is about the Agudas Yisrael, trying to, you know, have the Tehran children be raised in Orthodox setting. And these are these fights at the very beginning of the founding of the state of Israel that have not gone away exactly, right? These are very much with us at this point. And to think about how this story is so incredibly important for us to understand current Israeli politics. She says, and you quote, that about Agudas Yisrael, she says, we learned from our loss in the fight over the Tehran children how to organize politically. So maybe you want to comment on that a little bit as well.
Yeah, you know, I do, when people ask me about my book, and I think somebody wrote in one of the reviews, I mean, I think the book is about the past, but it's about the present, because we are living the consequences of those knots, of these historical knots and these moments, and on every level, on the level of the Polish-Jewish relations, on the level of Orthodox secular relations in Israel, and that's absolutely true. I mean, so when you start deciphering that, you see that even Iran, even in terms of the Iran Israel, and we can talk about that maybe if we have time.
Right.
Yeah, so when the Tehran children came to, so they were brought to Palestine. They came in two waves. One was in February 1943 and one in August. And immediately there was a kind of political war about who will get these children. I mean, there was really a war between political parties. Now, the people who sort of brought them were the Labor Party, and the idea was that they would go to kibbutzim, to collective settlements. Also because pedagogically, that was thought at the time to be the best way to rehabilitate children, and it's continued. And I actually agree with that. I mean, when you said about what we can take from my story, I think that's a thing we can take even for contemporary orphaned refugees. But immediately there started a battle between, and their religious parties, both Mizrahi, which was the Zionist religious parties, and especially the ultra-Orthodox parties, where they said, you know, we want to get our share of these children, and some of them came from our people in Poland, and we want to raise them. So it just became an all-out fight, including kidnapping of children, and so on. And you know, with my father and his sister, there was some fight with some relative who wanted to claim them and said they need to be brought up in a Mizrahi institute and so on. Now, so again, and this goes back to sort of uncovering things. I'm the heir of, because my father was ultimately sent to a kibbutz, and I was born to my father, I really only knew the kind of secular side of the Tehran children. And the people who I knew who were Tehran children were all people basically who grew up in kibbutzim, and some of them became army people and so on. I didn't really realize that ultimately about a third of them ended up being sent to religious institutions, not so much Agudat Israel, but to Mizrahi and so on. Now, that their fate is completely different. I mean, the next generation, I mean, my father had another cousin who came later, and arbitrarily, because these other children were put in a kibbutz, they said, okay, we'll put her with a religious family in a religious village. so that's how she grew up. And then her kids became radicalized. So the next generation became radicalized. So one of her children is now a very radical settler. And well, we grew up to be whatever what we grew up to be. Now, Ayala Rothenberg was Gudat Israel counselor, and that's exactly what she told me. I interviewed her, and she said, "Look, we lost the battle over Tehran Children because we weren't politically savvy enough, because we didn't participate in mainstream politics, and we lost. We didn't get our share of the children, but we learned from that experience. And of course, we see these elections, right? In these very elections in Israel now, that the ultra-Orthodox parties are very politically organized and very savvy. So it was quite something to hear that.
Well, so before we open this up, one last question before we open it up to Q&A here. And I love that your incredibly moving family memoir and historical text doesn't end on some redemptive note here, right? Which often we see in Holocaust stories, but rather it ends with a plaintive question, right, of a young daughter. And you ask of a distant father, right? Why do you love your mother more than your own daughter, right? As a child would ask a father. And it's a question after reading this book that we all have different answers to, having read this book. You mentioned the ease you felt with your aunt Rivka, and that you never felt that way with your father. And now, having spent so many years researching and writing this book, have you gained a measure of peace with the memory of your father? And not redemption or anything like that. I'm thinking more like, there's that Kafka diary entry, right, in which he talks about he wants a little space where maybe he could just go and breathe a little bit once in a while, something along those lines, maybe a little bit of a small space of understanding between father and daughter here.
Yeah. Totally. I feel truth liberates. That's why I'm an academic. And I think, yes, I think I really understand my father a lot better. I wish I had this knowledge when he was still alive. Unfortunately, he died relatively young. He died in 93, he was 66. And my aunt lived a lot longer. With my aunt, I was not that close to my aunt either, but through working on the book, and again, I realized also, and this is true of all survivors, but I think when you know the right questions to ask, and the more you know, the more you have a connection, and the more they answer. And this is what happened with her. She was very resistant. She was like, "Leave it. Why do you want to do this? Write on poetry." But she really came around to appreciating this. And I do, yes, I absolutely. It's been a great gift to simply know what my father went through, and also it's on many levels, and also as a Jew, not just as a daughter. As a daughter, absolutely, but also because I think the Holocaust is this, for many of us, for me certainly, it's like this enormous shapeless thing. It's so overwhelming. It's so awful that I, for many years, just didn't want anything to do with it, in my own research and writing and so on. And when you break it down to one story, as awful as it is, it's a specific story. It's not just this kind of shapeless thing that overtakes you. It's when you can mourn, right? You can mourn, and you can mourn, and you can understand also what has been lost. And so much has been lost. So much has been lost. But it doesn't necessarily overwhelm you in the way that it did, before I wrote this book.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And there is that image of Hanan surviving and actually, being reunited with his mother. At least his father didn't make it out, right? Your grandfather, but your grandmother did, and so he had that. He had that sense, and his family was at least one of the lucky ones in that sense as well, right? Which is itself a remarkable story, right? And how they were surviving where they were, right? And as you said, this is part of the story of the Holocaust that not many people know, of how many of the survivors ended up in the regions in which you're focusing a lot of your research on.
Yeah, and I should say that, in part it's not known, in part, I mean, it's not known for a lot of reasons, but in part it's because it has to do with who we call survivor and who we don't call survivor. And I think also in many ways, these people did not call themselves survivor and were not considered survivors. So that's
Right.
kind of a whole other set of questions, but
Right.
yeah.
Well, that brings up the question in Israel, right, of Shoah de Gevura, right, of this idea of catastrophe and strength, and how could you be both of those, right? You can't both be, a survivor and also a chalutz, right, who's going to be building the new state of Israel here. And in some ways, that was part of the dilemma here of and maybe has something to do with your father's reticence early on, right?
Yeah.
That's a whole other discussion we could have about that perception within Israel itself, which had a pretty dramatic effect on many survivors and their inability to speak about what they had been through, of course.
Yeah, I think that's changed a lot, but when I was growing up, that was definitely the norm.
Yes. So let's open this up for questions to the audience here. Kim, do we have some questions coming in here? And let's see. Okay, Anita Nussbaum has a question here. Okay, let's see. Okay.
Yeah, this is Alan. Why do we not know about this story? Why was it not something that the American Jewish community was more aware of? And why did it take so long for this to really become known?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and question that I often get asked. I mean, it's a couple of things. First of all, this story has to do with the Soviet side, and those archives were not very available, right? I mean, first of all, you had to wait until the collapse of the Soviet Union to even have access to those archives. And even now, when you have access to those archives, so ultimately, the Nazis documented everything. They documented their own massacres. They documented, they had lists of people that they were deporting. The Soviets, for example, the labor camps and the gulags. I mean, there is no footage. There is no footage. Hardly any. I mean, here and there is something. So there's no footage, and there were not. I mean, there was a lot of obscurity around documents. Secondly, and this is my first answers. And it's a really good question. I mean, there is actually a memoir by somebody named Margolin who went through this journey, not in Iran, but in the Soviet Union. And there is some Ruth Franklin is writing a whole review of it for the New York Review of Books, and she's also writing about my book. And her question is like, why is it that Elie Wiesel became the symbol of the Holocaust and not Margolin, for example? What? Because these are questions of cultural memory and politics and so on. In term the people who survive in the East, for example, first of all, were not included, for example, in the reparations agreement that Israel negotiated with Germany. So they didn't receive reparations. They were not commemorated. They were, I think, for many years they've considered people who were not survivors, right? The people who escaped the Holocaust. And I think one of the things that my book exposes also the level of suffering that they went through. I mean, they weren't hounded as Jews and they weren't put in death camps. And again, I mean, I really try to not fall into this kind of competition of suffering, but it's very, I think it's wrong to say, that these were not survivors and these were just people who escaped. Yes, they escaped Nazi occupied Poland, but they had their own ordeal. So another reason was that simply that they weren't politically considered survivors. Now that's changing, and partly because of my book. So the Holocaust Museum in DC is actually collecting the documents of these people, and it is incredible. I mean, even I get emails and messages from people, and people write me and they say, and I swear to you, this is true, they say, oh my God, my father was in Uzbekistan and I thought he was the only one. You know, I just told you that nearly 250,000 people were there, but you know, and that really it brought home to me again the need for a story and a framework, because if you don't have that, you think your parent was the only one there. So that's the second question about the definition of and I just think simply the stories of the death camp were so overwhelming that they took over. You know, the Tehran children, when they arrive in 43, when they arrive in Palestine, people are treating them as basically as survivors. They're weeping. I mean, they see how the horror of what they went through. But in 45, when they learn what actually happened in the death camp, suddenly the narrative of these children changes, and all of a sudden they were the lucky ones who had it easy, right? Because they weren't exterminated, or they didn't survive a concentration camp. But you know, ultimately, I don't know why the story of a lot of people compare the story of the Tehran children to the Kinder transport, and the story of the Kinder transport is super well known and documented in America. And in part, I think also the story of the Tehran children in themselves is, in part, it's because they're kind of like Jews saving Jews, and bringing them to Palestine is not. It just didn't get as much prestige maybe or something as this other story. So it remained a kind of internal Israeli story. In Israel, it's very well known. But again, it's not known, not the whole story is known, but it's very well known. People know what the Tehran children were.
We have a question from one of my students, Connor Combs. Connor, you want to ask your question?
So you mentioned that there was a travel ban on Iran, and I'm not too familiar with Israeli and Iranian history, but was that ban during the Tehran children or after?
I'm sorry, would you say there was a travel ban, you said?
Yes, you said there was a travel ban for you to travel to Iran to do your research, and your co-researcher had to go do it for you. Was that set during the Tehran children or after?
No, so in 1979, there was a revolution in Iran, and it was called the Islamic Revolution. And then the regime with the people who rule Iran now are the people who are much more, who are basically Shia fundamentalists, you could say. And therefore, as an Israeli, it's not that I couldn't, because there was no travel ban in the sense that I actually have a dual citizenship. So technically, as an American, I could travel to Iran. It just didn't seem like the smartest thing to do, since I am also an Israeli and I was in the army and so on. So it was just too risky. But the travel ban, I mean, when the Tehran children came to Iran in 1942, it was actually one of the safest places to be.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Okay. Nancy Kaplan has a question. Would you like to ask the question, Nancy?
All right, thanks. I was wondering why the children came to mandate Palestine by such a circuitous route by sea. On the map, it was just so unbelievable, you know, and why there was no way of flying them there or whatever.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you noticed that. Yes, so should I put the map on again, or do people remember the map? I mean, you can basically, should I or shouldn't I?
Oh, no, we
Okay. You can drive from Tehran to Tel Aviv by land. I think it's less than 48 hours. The problem was this: in the middle between Tehran and Tel Aviv was Iraq. And the Iraqi government absolutely refused to let Jewish children going to Palestine pass through Iraq. Now, you had intervention on all levels, including Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt actually wrote to the Iraqi prime minister and said, look, this is a humanitarian case. These are children. And his answer was, we feel very bad for these children. We'll be happy to keep them in Iraq if you pay for their subsistence, but we're not going to let them pass to Palestine. So that is why they had to take this not only circuitous route, but very dangerous route, because the Indian Ocean was full of German sea mines. And, there was, they were this close to getting blown up. And you had bombers above them and sea mines below them. And it's a real miracle that they survived, but they did. Again, like every story, there are like all these versions, and they said maybe they should have done this, they should have done that, but that was the children who came in the second wave. There was just over 100 children in August, came by land with Polish soldiers.
And Evelyn Putnam has a question for you. Evelyn?
Oh. Well, the Central Asian republics had a history of being used by the Soviets as sort of dumping grounds for troublesome ethnic minorities. And I was wondering, were the children sent there as a decision of the Soviet authorities, or was there another reason? Was it sort of happenstance, or how did they end up there?
Right. Yeah. Yes, it was not just the children. It was basically Polish citizens, including Polish Jewish citizens, who were in labor camps all over the Soviet interior, but mostly in the north, but also in the middle, were released after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. We were released with the idea that they would fight with the Soviets against the Germans. When they were released, they basically were given the option of either kind of staying where they are or basically going to kind of a second exile. And as you said, that was the dumping ground. So basically, when you look at people's deportation cards, they're sort of deported there. It says like you have to go to this and this kolkhoz, this collective settlement, and go work with, I don't know, Akhimov and so on. But it wasn't as organized as the first deportation. So they weren't, the first deportation, they were actually put on cattle cars. It was almost like the deportation to concentration camps and Nazi labor camps. They put in cattle cars with no water and no food and locked up. And then a lot of people died during those deportations. In this second deportation exile, it's not organized. They're basically given a card that says where they need to go, and they go on trains or by car or they walk, or they're on carts. And a lot of people died during that transit period, and they go south. Now, as far as when I interviewed the refugees themselves, they would often say that my father wanted to take me to Uzbekistan because the weather there was dry and I had asthma. So the way they presented it is as free will, but it wasn't really free will. I think they did think that they're getting further away from the Nazis and by going south.
There is a question from Karen Julian. Aaron here.
Yes. Would you have never undertaken this amazing journey if you had not met socially with your Iranian English colleague at Columbia University?
Probably not. Who knows, why we do things, and it's a little bit hard to answer that question in retrospect, but that was definitely the initial imperative. And I do think, because you read, maybe you read my book, you saw that in every place I had a kind of partner who helped me with my research. And that was very important to me, because I think, Jewish history is a very heavy burden to carry, and it's very helpful, I think, when you have another person helping you carry it in some way. So Salar was that first person. And initially that was very important. So I probably, yes, initially I probably wouldn't, but I think very quickly it became something else than I originally thought. Originally I was very interested in this question of Iran because of the current situation with Iran. So I was like, wow, really, what were these refugees doing in Iran? How were they treated? And but the book became so much more than that.
Well, I think we are basically wrapping up here, Mikhal. I don't want to take us where our Zoom is supposed to be an hour or so long. We're a little bit over that. One last question just to kind of wrap up here a little bit. And you've touched upon this throughout our discussion here, and you're talking a little bit now about your research in Iran and how that might affect us thinking about Iran today, the politics of that. Maybe you could comment a little bit more about that, because you talk about other rescue operations that we know so much about, the Kinder Transport. There are many others, Varian Fry's rescue operation. There's some very famous ones, and then others that are equally compelling and important that we know so little about. And I'm wondering what you hope with your book, which is gaining so much momentum here for understanding this important story from the Holocaust. What do you hope this will accomplish in addition to telling this actual story? But what else do you think it could do for us, and the importance of the story? Why, particularly now, is this so important for us to know about the Tehran Children?
Yeah, I mean, I think the book is gaining a lot of momentum, and for different reasons. I mean, it's also coming out in Germany, and the person. And a later Assmann, who is like a major German intellectual, public intellectual, wrote an afterword for it, and it's incredible, it's beautiful. And she said, I mean, she focused on this question of refugees, and she said we can understand refugees through this book. So I think people focus on different things. I've had a lot of invitations from Iranian studies programs. There is an Iranian media company that is based in London that made a short film about the book. And I think the hope is that they will kind of sneak it into Iran, and they will use it as for Holocaust education in Iran itself, because with the idea that contemporary Iranians can connect to the story of the Holocaust through the story more than the story of Europe. So I think there are a lot of different kind of afterlives of this book. And to the degree that it can create some bridges and some empathy between groups, and that is definitely not the whole story, because I get all kinds of hate mail from nationalist Poles and from all kinds of people who haven't really read the book but have some ideas about it. So it's by no means all positive, but I think there is a lot of positive, and there are a lot of even people from Uzbekistan. People wrote me and so on. So it puts together a lot of places that usually don't go together on the map, and a lot of populations, and a lot of classes, and a lot of everything. And that's really been really satisfying. And also I should say, and maybe the most important thing is the giving those descendants of people who are heirs to the story, like me, a book that they can then use as a framework to understand their own story and kind of fill in the blanks. And that's been maybe the most satisfying thing, because that's really a great feeling to connect to those communities and those people.
Absolutely. I'm sure your father was not the only Tehran child to not speak very much or at all about his experiences. So your book must be incredibly opening for all sorts of conversations in many other families and descendants. Like you said, many thousands by now, right? In Israel and elsewhere around the world at this point.
Yeah, but also, again, a lot of the people who were in the story of people who were made in Central Asia it's so pervasive. I mean, every time, we had Masha Gessen from the New Yorker. She spoke in my institute in New York, in the Rifkin Institute. So then we had dinner. She was like, oh, actually my grandfather was in Turkmenistan. And somehow, because this is most Polish Jewish survivors, then obviously a lot of us second and third generation people who are here are heirs to this story. And so that's been really interesting to connect to people. Sometimes even the people themselves, not only children and grandchildren, people themselves who didn't really understand the whole thing, or people who let's say, had documents and diaries and never shared them with anybody because there was no repository for them. So now they can sort of send it and I can connect them to the Holocaust Museum. So that's been really nice.
Well, it's nice for those families and nice for all of your readers. And we are so appreciative of all the hard work that went into this incredible book. And I urge everyone to go out and buy a copy and read it. And we are so appreciative of your joining with us this evening, Mikhal Dekel. And we hope to have you again back in Charleston in person, right, where we could show you some of our Southern hospitality, maybe for one of the next books that you're talking about, the sequel that was cut out of this amazing book here. And great. A lot for us to think about and reflect on. The subtitle, Holocaust Refugee Odyssey. The question of refugees and refugee children, especially, as you mentioned, so important for us all to think about, reflect upon, and hopefully be more empathetic towards in our world today. So thank you so much for this discussion, and thank you all for joining with us. And we hope to see you again at many of our upcoming events. The Oshik Arnold Jewish Studies program has many, many events happening. So do check out our website for upcoming events and hope to see you all there soon. Take care.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you
Ezra,
very
thank
much.
you so much for really wonderful questions. It was such a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. It was great catching up after all this time.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.